I have been focusing on commitment. Last week focused on the words, one Hebrew word for courage. And today I want to try and bring all of those things together in a message which kind of seems long overdue. You know, when you think you're trying to know what God's word says and you're trying to follow and things still seem to be going wrong. And don't think that I haven't thought through how people might twist what I'm going to say today, but that's okay. I'm prepared for that because there's always some capacity for somebody to take the takeaway being completely not what I meant. But there is a person in the Bible who I'm going to talk about today. I've been kind of camping out on people, focusing on different Bible personages, because if you cannot relate to these people, they are for us a template. They are a mirror at times. They are exactly like we are. In fact, James talks about Elijah and says he was a man just like us, of like passions, and goes on to say that he prayed earnestly in the space of 3 years, 6 months, that it wouldn't rain. And I think a lot of times we forget when we study this book, as I've talked about different people last week. I talked about Gideon. Very easy to get into a caricature of these people and not make an application. And for this church and this ministry that has so much teaching, it's easy to say, oh yeah, I've been there, I've studied that, I've heard that message. But I wanted to glean something specifically today about people who have made a commitment. They have heard the message on courage. It takes courage to be a Christian. It takes courage to have faith. It takes courage to get in this book and start walking just like these people did. And we have the benefit of having the whole book. They didn't. So I think the thing that I want to get into is how often when we think we're following God's plan by His Word, not by what you imagine, but by His Word, what is revealed to us, how when things are not going right, it may not be, the cause may not be what you actually think it is. There's always a lesson to be gleaned in. I'm going to talk about Elijah, but don't turn there just yet. In Elijah's case, there are 3 things that I observed about this man that are very easy and they're very simple. I'll give you the history, really, really brief history in a minute, but 3 things that I observed about him that would tell you that if you would judge Christianity by what you see on TV, excluding my program, gratuitous plug, but if you were to judge Christianity based on what you see on TV, you are told that you can only receive God's blessings a certain way, that somehow if things are going bad, you're not doing it right. But here's an individual that God called and chose, and 3 things. He brought him to a drying brook. He brought him to a widow with a depleted barrel, and that widow's son, a dying boy. Do you see a pattern there? Because I do. It's like everywhere this guy goes, stuff is coming to an end, which in TV land would suggest that there's definitely something wrong with you. You're not doing it right. But in fact, if we take the lessons, and there's one specifically I will focus on, is this drying brook. There was a famine running rampant from the drought. Many people looked death eye to eye. It's not as though the history is complicated. We have a record that tells us that the drought was brought on because of the people's disobedience in worshiping idols and foreign gods, specifically the idols. And if you go back into the history of Israel, it's pretty plain. God knows in general people have a propensity for going the wrong way, which is why people oftentimes when they read the Old Testament and God says He's a jealous God, they fail to understand that there's a whole record of why He's a jealous God, because it's in our nature to quest for other things. When you look at the history of Israel, the United Kingdom, this is a real brief history. 3 kings over the period of 100 years. Saul, who we know, that chapter didn't end very well. David, and then his son Solomon. And that was the end of the united kingdom. We know because of Solomon's affection for strange women, as the Bible puts it, and they weren't really that strange. They just worshipped other gods. I thought I'd clarify that. Or they might have been strange too, but who knows. But they worshipped other gods. They lured his heart away to worship their gods instead of the one God. And it was foretold. It was a prophecy that said that the kingdom would be rent, would be torn apart. It would not be a united kingdom anymore at the death of Solomon. But for David's sake, the kingdom stayed, David, Solomon's father, the kingdom stayed united until the death of Solomon. When Solomon died, civil war broke out, and you've got a whole history in the, what I'd call the historical records of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, that tells us all we need to know about the events leading up to that first episode under the king Jeroboam, who placed idols at Dan and Bethel to try and stop the people from going to the epicenter of worship, to avoid them disappearing out of his grasp. And that began a whole cycle of kings. If you take the kings that would reign, a whole cycle of evil kings. By and large, for the most part, most of these kings, it says, did evil in God's eyes. In fact, the northern kingdom had 19 monarchs, and it says of all of them, and so did evil in the Lord's sight. Pretty good track record that they all ended up that way. That is to the north, and that northern kingdom, I told you it's brief history. If you want the rest of it, you got to read the book. But the north is carried away by the Assyrians in 722, displaced and deported, and that period comes to a close. Then you've got the southern kingdom that will tarry until the year 586 BC, which then begins the Babylonian captivity and the 70 years prophesied by Jeremiah regarding the people. And if you keep going, the last chapter of 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah tell of the rebuilding, the return of the people, the few that returned, and the rebuilding of the epicenter of that place where they worshipped. That gives you, that's a pretty big history real quick. But if you want to kind of focus down on where I'm going, in 1 Kings, the 16th chapter, and we jump right in there, and if you don't have a Bible, just look at your neighbor's. Don't look at your neighbor, look at your neighbor's Bible. All kinds of humor here. In 1 Kings 16, we have a chronicle going on of the historical records of the kings of Israel. Omri being the sixth, who moves the capital, buys a hill, moves the capital, and makes the epicenter of that kingdom Samaria. And something very important is said in verse 25, a repetition which will be said of all the kings, but verse 25, 1 Kings 16 and 25, but Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord and did worse than all that were before him. And this is pretty bad when you get memorialized with the one who initiated idol worship, because it says, for he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin, to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities, with their idol worship. And so I'm just kind of diving right into the middle of the history right there to show here's this long pattern, and pretty bad when you were at the beginning, you were one of the first kings from after the kingdom divided, and you're still being talked about here as the one who began all of this. Now, Omri dies, and his son Ahab will reign. And it says, if you keep reading down verse 30, and Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. So it just keeps getting worse and worse. And it came to pass as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. Now, there's something really interesting here, which is, of all the kings that are mentioned, there's only one where we have the wife really being mentioned by name and details are being given about her, and that is because I would say, based on what we know, she wore the pants in that relationship. And, well, well, put you this way. I try not to give my personal opinion, but I know what the Bible says about the order of things. In the New Testament, we're told about the man being the head of the house. She obviously made sure that I could just imagine what went on in the palace. Hey, Ahab, it's going to be my way or the highway, so you better get busy building those groves, and you get out there and send the people to do what I tell you. She kind of sounds like that type of a personality from what we know of her. And it's in this context that a man by the name of Elijah, it just appears in the Bible very much like Melchizedek appears. There is no beginning. We have no record of him. We have really no real family established record of things. Usually prophets and people in the Bible, we can follow their lineage back. He just appears. He does the bidding in Ahab's court, which begins chapter 17, basically telling the king that it will not rain anymore. And that's where I jump in and I begin a very short reading. It will be no more than 7 verses of reading. So here we go. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, just marched into the court, said to him, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. Now, we know that this prophecy of drought came at the backdrop way back there in Deuteronomy, in the early stages of the Bible, where it says God said this, that if they ever worshipped idols, he would shut up the heavens. So here is the prophet declaring something. And the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, after you've made this announcement, get thee hence, turn thee eastward, and hide thyself by the brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. Now, I want you to see something really interesting. For those of you who might think that I just gave you a whole beginning of a message and now I'm jumping into something and it's disconnected. It's not. See, a lot of times we're trying to find out what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. And I want you to see something. Here, God just gives Elijah the information he needs step by step. He doesn't give it all in advance. He doesn't say, now look, you're going to go here and you're going to go there and then you're going to go and do that over there. It's piece by piece as he needs it. And I really think that God does that. First, to make us depend on him. Second, because he knows our way. If he gave us the roadmap to, we're supposed to go from A to D, he knows all of the side roads that we would invent and make up to get off the path, maybe a little bit like Jonah, to go the opposite way of where we need to go or where we're supposed to go. So the prophet's only given piece by piece instruction, which I think sometimes for some of us, if you've got a personality like mine, it can be very frustrating. I want to know the whole thing, how this is going to work out. Because if this is going to bomb, I'm out of here. Right? You know how that goes. But he says, and an interesting word in this 3rd verse, hide thyself. Now, something unique about Elijah, he doesn't strike me as a Nathan, like David had Nathan, and David lived in some form of luxury. So that means Nathan probably lived in some form of luxury. But it seems to me that this instructions, that hide thyself by the brook Cherith, very congenial to Elijah, very conducive to what he would be used to. So it's not something out of like, wow, he's being sent out. I've heard people write commentaries talk about, and the prophet was sent into seclusion. Well, yes, and sometimes God sends us apart for a reason. I'm not sure that this was unusual for him to be apart. He seems like a rough, loner mountain man that would not be nestled in with the crowd all the time. So nothing, for me at least, nothing unusual. There isn't any record here that says how long he was there, but it says, verse 4, it shall be that thou shalt drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed thee there. Unclean birds, by the way. We'll leave that one alone. So he went and did according unto the word of the Lord, for he went and dwelt by the brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and flesh in the morning, and bread and flesh in the evening, and he drank of the brook. And this is the focus I want to talk about today. And it came to pass after a while that the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. If you know the rest of Elijah's record, it seems pretty clear that once the brook dried up, don't you think about this, Elijah could have prayed for more water. Because remember, it's going to be his prayer later on Mount Carmel, that prayer for water that brings the small cloud, that brings the rain. He could have prayed here. The story could stop right here. And Elijah prayed for more water at the brook. But it didn't happen that way. And I think I'm going to now envision something. I'm going to envision, because it doesn't say how long. It just says it came to pass after a while. We don't know what that was. Was that days? Was that months? But I can just see him going down to the brook and drinking and washing and getting his daily fix of whatever the birds brought him. It's kind of gross. But he lived, right? But I could just see, because we don't tend to do this. We don't tend to analyze like this. We just read, and we read verse by verse, and we don't stop for a minute and think what it must have been like. Because I doubt that from one day to the next, it could be the way God does things. It could be that one day there was water and the next day there wasn't. But I think it was over the course of time. There was no rain. There is a 3.5, there will be a 3.5 year drought. It's pretty safe to say that he had to go out every single day and watch the water get less and less and less and less, from a bustling sound to suddenly there's just a trickle, to maybe he looked down, there was just a little bit, and then all of a sudden he comes out and there is parched silence, nothing. And when you stop to think about that, my brain kicked into gear, thinking there is something very profound about this, because we know it says after the brook dried up, the word of the Lord came to him saying, now rise and get to Zarephath. And he's going to go from one drawing what looks like death and the end of something, bad luck, to the next place where God says, go into town and find a widow and she'll feed you and she'll take care of you. And I'm sure he went into town and said, I'm looking for the richest widow. Anybody seen her? But instead, he goes into town and finds a woman who's gathering sticks and just a little bit of meal in her hand. She says, I'm going to go cook this, and then me and my kid are going to go die. They're going to die of starvation. That's what this man was sent to. So I want to go back to the brook for a minute. What the brook represented for Elijah, for a lot of us, I think we don't stop to think about this because we're so busy to get to the story and to get to the end of it. I want to focus on the brook. And I want to ask, has that happened to you? Have you watched something disappear and dry up in your life? And that could be anything. It could be anything from prosperity, your bank account, your love life, a loved one, including the passing of a loved one. And think about the reaction as Elijah watched something that God had sent him to, which had God's blessing on it, had God's instruction. Go there, receive of this, to have it taken away. And Elijah doesn't know the next step. Piece by piece, he gets his information. So there's something right there that's very interesting, which is the man or woman of God, the person who's trying to follow God's will, needs to get a little dose of patience. That when things start to change, things start to dry up, and you know the expression, it's going south. Maybe it's not that you're out of God's will. I think a lot of times the question is, maybe Elijah would have stood there and said, why did the brook dry up? Why did this happen? Well, it's a no-brainer. There's a drought, right? No-brainer. But God could have miraculously, like he's done many times before, kept the water going, including when they'll be up on Mount Carmel. Remember our famous line, where do you get the water? Where did that water come from? But never mind. You have to be here for the last 30 years to get that one, I guess. It won't make sense to anybody else. But why did the brook dry up? God had another place of provision for the prophet. God had something else to teach the prophet. But he didn't disclose it all at once. So I go back to asking you what your brook might be. And glean a little bit. Don't just make this a caricature. Glean a little bit that there might be a reason. We may not be satisfied with the answer when it comes to pass, but because we were comfortable there, we liked it there, we had comfort in something that we could stop on and say, this is safe and secure, but going to the next step or moving on is really bad because it's the fear of the unknown. You don't know what is ahead, and isn't that what we spend most of our time being anxious about? the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen, and then we spend all of our time spinning our wheels. Remember the great message, fret not. We spend most of our time, by the way, even though we know what the instructions are, fretting. So somebody might say, well, the brook dried up because, not knowing God's ways, because God forgot about the prophet. Well, we know that's not true. So I want you to make that same application to you. If things in your life seem to be drying up or running dry or dissipating, God hasn't forgotten about you. Just as I said, using James, which I seldom quote from, James 5:17 and 18, Elijah was a man like us, like passions. And I love the fact that at least there we can say, yes, he was right. Exactly that. Given the instructions as needed and not the whole roadmap. And we live in an age where we want all the answers. And by the way, you can get them all. Just go on the internet and you've got answers for everything, right? Most of the time. I have a friend of mine who likes to read every article that comes up in a search for whatever they're looking for. And it can be very challenging at times because when that information comes up, there's a hodgepodge of things. And that sometimes can be difficult to glean out what is right and what is wrong and what is good. But we live in an age where it's accessible to us. We can just get it. We can ask for it. It's there. It's quick. So the lesson here is patience. God will give each day and bread for each day and strength for each day. And if we're willing to listen, instructions for each day, because the next thing it says, and the word of the Lord came unto him. And I know that's the way that happened in the Old Testament. And the word of the Lord came to so-and-so. But if we are studying this word and we are praying and we're seeking God's will, I always feel like somehow God's word and God's ways line up with the things that we are needing guidance for. Ultimately, we get our answers here. So patience and learning to live with the bread, or like in the Old Testament, the manna that came every day, manna for every day, bread for every day, instructions for every day. And let me try and move a little bit forward here, because I don't want to go too far away from the brook that dried up, because there's more lessons to glean. But let me take you to Zarephath, because if we're going to go through the steps, the Lord sent him to Zarephath. So we almost go from bad to worse. Arise, get thee to Zarephath. Now, I'd like God to tell me, when I'm preparing for next week, I'd like God to say, now, open your Bible, turn to page 1329, and that's what I want you, halfway down the page, that's the verse right there. I'd love that. But it never happens that way. And I have to sometimes agonize and work it out the whole week and try and figure out and pray through it. So at least here, he's given instructions. Arise, get thee to Zarephath. And I won't tell you what Zarephath means. We'll just move on. Which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow woman was there gathering of sticks. And he called to her and said, fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. She was going to fetch it. He called to her and said, bring me, I pray thee, a morsel of bread in thine hand. Kind of interesting, the audacity of this man to come into town, and he sees the woman. He says, get me water, give me food. Typical male, right? Well, that may be typical male in prison, though. That there's prison food, bread and water. All right. So she says, as the Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse, and behold, I am gathering 2 sticks that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die, because we're going to starve. Elijah said unto her, fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first, bring it unto me, and after make for thee and thy son. That's kind of interesting, because that is a declaration of faith. God didn't say, I'll make a way for you to proclaim provision. That was a declaration of faith. For thus saith the Lord of Israel, the barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. How long was that? 3.5 years. So think about this, and think about the fact that where God took from one place uncertainty and the provision and watching something dry up, which I said, that drying up Brook to we'll call it a drying or depleting barrel. And somehow in that, there's another lesson, step by step, day by day, and the unique experiences of this prophet, but they should actually be lessons to us, which is God will never, never call someone to a place, and I'm talking about the reality of, there's not, the Lord told me this. I'm talking about you've stayed by the stuff, you have been at the place where the Lord has placed your feet, where the Lord won't provide for you and make a way, even if it seems like the most ludicrous thing in the world. And I hate to say it, but there's no better example than when I look at myself and my life here. I've told you, I've used myself in many messages as an example. How crazy it would be to think that the Lord would provide for this church a successor, and it be a woman, and it be Dr. Scott's wife, and go down the list of things, but that's kind of the way that's the way God does it. I always tell people who say, well, I'm not sure, people who question, people who doubt. Well, trust me, if you're in this book, this is exactly the way God does it. He does it exactly the opposite of the way you would do it. And that's how you know it's God's way. But I think the biggest lesson out of this is that, again, from the first round of piece by piece, bread for the day, there comes this, I want to say, confident faith in declaring something, that there'll be provision enough, there'll be bread enough in your house, just like the prodigal having wandered away, to spare. And I think in the day of calamity, we're always prone to do this. We're always prone to rush into, God's taken his hand off of me, God's not doing what he said he would do. How many have watched, and I go back to the Brook for a minute, some health crisis come upon you, and that's it. You say, God has removed his hand, and my good health or my good fortune, whatever it is, it's gone. It's ebbing away. If you look at the three things I pointed out, this brook, the barrel that was depleting, although there's a promise for the oil not to fail for 3.5 years, and then the last one would be about the woman's son. It came to pass after these things, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, fell sick, and his sickness was sore. There was no breath left in him. She said unto Elijah, What have I to do with thee, O man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son? You came to my house to do this? Now, we suddenly forgot about the provision of bread and the miracle of oil. You came to bring death to my house? And he said unto her, Give me thy son. Took him out of her bosom, carried him up into a loft where he abode, laid him upon his own bed, cried unto the Lord, and said, O Lord my God, hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn by slaying her son? Stretched himself upon the child 3 times. And what's really important, again, I talked about the birds being unclean. Anything dead, touching a dead body would make you unclean. There's somewhere nestled into the Old Testament, there are always vignettes or pictures of God talking through the Old Testament, looking at the New, because there's no way that a man who was acquainted with the worship of idols back there in Deuteronomy, there's no way that he also didn't know that touching a dead body would make him unclean. And yet, it says 3 times. What is that? Divine manifestation. 3 is the number of divine manifestation. Cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come into him again. The Lord heard the voice of Elijah. The soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down out of the chamber into the house, delivered him unto his mother. And Elijah said, See, thy son liveth. And the woman said to Elijah, Now by this I know that thou art a man of God. No, not by the miracle of the bread and the oil, but by bringing my son back to life, because she must have been a real hardhead. And the word of the Lord in thy mouth is truth. Now, these 3 things should be a lesson to each one of us, that sometimes when we're following after God, there will be times where it will seem as though God is shutting something off. We've seen that here. We've seen this here over the years, where we think we should be more prosperous. There should be more things going, and yet somehow there isn't. I think God uses those moments of depletion, of drying up, of dissipating, even of death, or things being removed, to bring new opportunities to trust Him, new opportunities of faith. Now, I have not yet seen somebody revived. I haven't seen that. But I have seen God provide out of something that seemed to be surely not enough to make a way, and yet somehow it was. Now, I'm asking you to focus on what it might mean for you if it seems like people are telling you your whole life is full of a series of things that are being removed, taken away, and somehow you are not doing too good. Maybe God is teaching you a lesson in the things that He lets dwindle down. And the lesson may not always be what you think it is. And here in this case, it would be that the Lord would provide another way of provision, and the Lord would provide another opportunity. And the Lord also gave the prophet Elijah an opportunity to put on display the power of God. I like what F.B. Meyer, I brought his little book out here. F.B. Meyer wrote a whole little tiny book, and it's an old book on Elijah, and it's kind of a funny signature in here. The opening, I pull books off the shelf. This says Inez Scott, not Jean Scott, and that's Dr. Scott's writing, by the way. So back then they probably were fighting over books too. I know I had to get that from somewhere. But F.B. Meyer says something really important. He says that the power is available. He says there is nothing the church of today needs so much as spiritual power. There is nothing which we can have so easily if we are prepared to pay the price, and that is to listen and be obedient to what God's word says and wait on the Lord, exercising, by the way, as I said, patience, which is the first lesson, that sometimes God will put you in a place to be alone, not because He thinks you need to be punished, but you need time to focus on Him. And that may not be by a brook somewhere. That may simply be removing distractions in your life that make it so easy for you to not listen to God. And I just said a mouthful because most of you know what I'm saying. It's so easy to get distracted, to not listen when there are other things moving around you. So sometimes God will remove something for a time to get clarity before He puts His hand back again to bless. But F.B. Meyer said that makes sense to me. If the church doesn't have power, I said the church is impotent today. The church in general, Christendom, is impotent today and has no capacity to make an influence anywhere, by and large, because people are less and less opening this book and more talking about the power of what's in them and how they possess what they can do and how they can change the world. And that may be great if you're looking for the power of positive thinking, but if you're looking for God's way, God's looking for people to trust Him and take Him at His word, and that has never changed from day one, from the garden until the end of time. That will be what God is looking for. The New Testament says when the Son of Man comes, shall He find faith? How does faith come? From this word. We're talking about biblical faith, from this word. I would say this, a lot of times our inclination is to say that God has turned away and turned His back, and He is no longer interested because He wouldn't let these things be taken away. And so probably the biggest lesson is to learn to trust that if God called you, the book of Ephesians talks about the calling, that we are people who are called out of a myriad of number of people who have not been called out from this earth, from this generation, that if He's called you, He's well able to finish what He started. And how does He get the job done? But sometimes putting you into the Dry Brook. In fact, I did a festival one time, it just came to me, the Dry Brook University. If you watch that, that kind of sums it up. God will sometimes put you through that school to make you understand it's His time and His order of things. So you've got free will to do whatever you want. Go out there and do it. But if you're looking to follow God's leading, this is the way it's going to be. Learn to trust God. Learn to take the instructions and listen. Somebody said, well, how do you listen? If God never speaks to you, how do you listen? Well, you start first. Praying is one way of communication, and this is the Old and New Testament, which is God speaking to us. The book of Hebrews says in the last days has spoken to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. But this is Old and New Testament, the last word to us from him. So here's where you do a little bit more listening. Even though you're reading and you're using your eyes, you do a little bit more listening when you're in this book and you start to get to know more about God. And you figure out that his ways with you may be to put you in a place first that looks like a wonderful, beautiful retreat, and all of a sudden a little bit less and a little bit less, and suddenly whatever it was that you think was the blessing is gone. And it's usually because God has something to move you on. If you never grow in God, you have arrested development. Just like anything else, there's something wrong. You keep growing, you keep progressing. You don't go to school to stay at the same level and the same grade and stay at the same, you move on. And this is how God moves you on, sometimes by checking the pulse, the faith pulse. Have you gleaned anything yet from this walk and journey you're on? And if the answer is no, good, I'm not done with you. That's what God's going to say. Now, I think I could leave this safely because I think I've put all the pieces together that I wanted to get across to say that there'll be a great victory when the prophets of Baal are gathered together and they're busy screaming and shouting and making all the brouhaha, and they're trying to say, our God is God and your God is dead, because that's what Jezebel essentially said. Your God, Jehovah, Yahweh, is dead. And this contest that occurs on Mount Carmel is probably one of the most ludicrous ones, because they have a whole dance and a whole thing. They think they're going to get rain. They're going to make this happen. They're going to call fire down. There's going to be a great display of their God's power. And ultimately, Elijah trumps it all with his call and his power with God. So here's the thing. I don't think God leaves us to the place of depletion or the place of drying up and depletion and even of the loss without preparing us for those are the steps to the victory that occurs at Carmel. There can never be a victory at Carmel without having passed through the steps. This is God's method with man. He puts you through the winepress. How do you get wine but the grapes are squeezed? How do you get olive oil but the olives are pressed? He puts us through the press of these depleting, narrowing down moments to bring out something that will enable us to get to that victory at Carmel. And there'll never be a time when you get to the mountaintop without going through the valleys. I think I've been saying this for weeks and maybe even years. So if you feel like things are kind of ebbing for you, just hold on. Just be a little bit patient. Go back and please, at your leisure, reread the whole passage, 16, that begins Elijah's need to waltz into Ahab's court, 17, which tells you about the widow, and 18 and onward that tells you about the conflict that will ensue on Mount Carmel and the victory. And I should include this. It's going to be a real climax killer here. But after that great victory, Elijah wants to go and run under a juniper tree and commit suicide. You're just a buzz killer here. You just ruined the thing, right? Because I was thinking, okay, I can make it. But the ultimate thing is that we are just like him. And cycles in our life will be just like that. And probably some of us need a little bit more dry brook experience than others. God knows that. I don't. But when it comes, don't look at the brook and say, oh my God, what am I going to do now? And how's this going to work out? But rather, the Lord will make a way. And if I'm really ready to listen to the word of the Lord, he'll provide another way for me to get what I need, because the New Testament says, my God shall supply all your need. Well, including the things that you think you may not be able to live without. He makes a way. Whatever that void, whatever that depletion is, he makes a way, he provides. Now, today may be the education of, for some of you, not all of you, that you came in thinking, whatever your problems are, I don't know how this is going to work out. I pray you leave here with just a little confidence that these people's lives are recorded not for entertainment. They're not recorded, as somebody once said, as good stories with great morals, because if you just think that, really you're missing, this part of this book at least has some really good, solid history in it, And I would go on to say that if you can't glean from people who actually lived, and their records are preserved for us to glean and learn that we too are just like Elijah, and God will provide and make a way. And when he closes, you've heard this proverbially, he closes one door, he opens another. When he dries up one brook or one whatever it was that you were looking at, chances are he's got something else he wants you to glean from and provide for you in a different way, which will teach you another way of understanding. This is God's way with man and developing us for the victories that lie ahead. It's a short message, but one that says, if you came in with that, oh my God, things are dissipating and depleting in my life, I hope you walk out of here knowing God's going to provide something else, just like he did for Elijah. He'll do it for you. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.